Hello, this is the lecture for European history for Wednesday, the 16th of March 2022. And we're going to try to get a lot done today so that you can take your exam tomorrow. If we don't, you can take it Friday. 3, 2, 1. Ding, 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 There we go. 4 minutes, Haley. 4 straight minutes.
She didn't know, but I read her text.
Yeah.
It's my fault.
Well, that's okay.
I got my cocktail.
Just understand that we were all saying nasty things about you while you were gone.
So
it was. I never heard certain things beforehand. I've studied cursing from way back. Don't tell your dog to stop it. It's like you're in charge or something.
I am.
Okay. So, a few things. First off, the Edwardian Era, 1899 to 1914. It really starts before Queen Victoria's death with the beginning of the Second Anglo-Boer War. The Anglo-Boer War is a struggle where the British start taking massive casualties for the first time since really the Crimean War, because they're fighting Europeans who have better rifles than they do. And what bestrides the world, which is dominated from Europe at this point, is the German Colossus. Germany has a larger population than anyone in Europe. Russia's Europe, Asia. But anyone in Europe, Germany has the fastest growing population and the largest population. And population means military manpower and industrial output. Germany's economy has overtaken the British Empire, or at least Great Britain, in terms of steel production and industrial output in general. France is basically stagnant. The British grow, but at a slower rate. The Americans are not really part of these equations, but we and the Germans are sort of neck and neck at this point. And Germany is led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, with the spiked mustache. Here, I can, I suppose, show you a picture of the man, which you'll need to recognize anyway. Let's see. Kaiser Wilhelm II. Science, biggest. Gosh, just all sorts of.
It's not my
noise.
fault. You know what, sir?
Cool.
What can you say? I'm not.
Good. So, here's Kaiser Wilhelm II as a fairly young man. His mustaches are epically spiked and waxed. This changes over time and becomes a bit less pronounced as he gets older. Well, you get a sense, but the spike is there in his mustache until the end of his life, where it sort of becomes curly Q. Anyhow, Wilhelm is the grandson of Queen Victoria, as well as the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm I, and he, as I explained earlier in the unit, is a man of action. He wants to go full steam ahead. Germany wants a place in the sun. So the most powerful country in Europe, by most measures, is led by a mercurial fellow. What you want in a powerful neighbor is steadiness, stability, no surprises. The Canadians do not want the United States to start becoming like Mexico, a chaotic country on the verge of civil war, because the Canadians live in our shadow. What they want is stability. Now, Bismarck provided stability. Wilhelm II wants it all. He wants an empire now. So he starts being aggressive to people like the Americans in the Philippines. He wants a navy, second to none, a high seas fleet. So he does something which is the most unforced error of this entire period. He starts building dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers to try to compete with Britain's Royal Navy. Now, Germany already has the most powerful army in Europe. The Russians are larger, but they're more backward. The French are much less powerful. The British, man for man, are at least as good as the Germans, but they have a very small army. Because Britain doesn't need a large army. It needs a navy. It needs control of the seas. It's an island empire, an island nation. Germany doesn't need a navy. Germany's coastlines are surrounded by tidal floods. It's very hard to approach Germany from the sea. That's why it wasn't done during the World Wars. But still, Wilhelm wants a navy, so he built a navy, and in doing so, he threatens the British. He threatens their lifeline, he threatens their naval supremacy, because the Germans do have the industrial output to outbuild the British if they really want to. So the British end up spending more and more and more money to try to put the test back in the show, to try to keep ahead of the Germans, and they do so. But it's needlessly painful economically, and it turns the British into enemies. We'll get to that. The French have been trying since the Franco-Prussian War to set up an alliance against Germany because they want Alsace-Lorraine back, because they want revanche. And Bismarck, with his Drei Kaiserbund, his Three Emperors League, prevented that. But after Bismarck's unceremoniously fired by Wilhelm II, Wilhelm lets the Drei Kaiserbund lapse. And almost immediately, in the early 1890s, the French and the Russians come to an accommodation. Why? The Russians are the most autocratic society in the European world. Their Tsar has more power than any Kaiser. But the Russians are irritated at the Austrians for the perceived threats to Serbia, and Serbia is composed of little Slavs, little Slavic brothers, South Slavs, Jugoslavs. So the Russians want to be in an alliance against the Austrians to counterbalance their influence because the Austrians are moving to fill the gap left by the Ottoman Empire as they retreat from most of its European territories. The French are thrilled. The French Republic now has the largest by number army in Europe, and even though in the Russo-Japanese War the Russians proved to be backwards and not very good at army or navy tactics in the modern world, the French are still comforted because any war with Germany will involve a war on Germany's eastern front against Russia. In the early 1900s, the British, who absolutely don't want to get involved in European affairs, they have talked about their splendid isolation for decades throughout the Victorian era. They don't want to get involved in continental entanglements, to paraphrase George Washington. The British are splendidly isolated. They're an enemy to none and an ally to none. They do their own thing because they're beyond Europe. They're an empire overseas. But the German race to build a navy second to none threatens Britain. So Britain joins the French and the Russians in what becomes known as the Triple Entente. The Franco-Russian alliance is called the Entente Cordiale. Entente Cordiale, the cordial understanding. The upper class of Russia at this point speaks French, so everything they talk about is in French, en français. So when Britain joins, this becomes the Triple Entente. So Britain, France, and Russia. Germany responds by formalizing its ties with Austria, and they get Italy involved. The Triple Alliance. Germany, Austria, Italy. The Triple Entente. France, Russia, Britain. Yeah. This was stupid. Because Germany certainly has a more modern army than Russia, and it has a better army in every way than France. By getting Britain involved in an alliance with the French and the Russians, Germany, in effect, is going to doom itself long term. Because if the British have time to bring the weight of their empire, which includes the population of India, into the war, Germany's not going to win. At least not without major luck. So these two alliances become readier and readier to fight at a moment's notice. They are psychologically prepared to see each other as enemies. And they become more and more resigned to the inevitability of war. Beware of this oratorical trick. People who are debating you will try to convince you that their side's victory is inevitable. I can't tell you how many teachers told me that having group project, standards-based education without lecture, where everyone gets a C except really good and really bad students who get an A or a D, and nobody fails, is the future of schooling. To which I said, nuts. I'm not teaching in this environment, period. But they kept saying, oh, it's inevitable. Look, this is the way it's the way the wind is blowing. You've got to go along. They didn't understand. I basically define myself as fighting against the inevitable, because commies have said that socialism and communism is inevitable since the time of Karl Marx. Actually, Robespierre implied things like that. Nothing's inevitable unless we let it be. Nothing is inevitable unless we accept it. Nothing. So the Europeans begin to play a psychological trick on themselves, whereby they assume sooner or later something's going to happen and it's all going to catch fire. The world will burn in another general war. And nobody's seen a war like this, because the last war between European nations was the Franco-Prussian War, which is about 2 or 3 generations ago in terms of warfare, war-fighting technology. The last big war was the American Civil War. And even though there were plenty of lessons for what was going to come in the American Civil War, the Europeans said, Americans fighting in the wilderness, they have no idea, they're unsophisticated. So the Europeans did not take the lessons that were there to be had about how to run a war in an age where you have high-powered long-distance rifle fire and Gatling guns. But everyone also has a general staff. A general staff is what makes modern warfighting possible, because they do all the planning. They plan where the troops will assemble, where the weapons will be stored, how the troops will move to the rail stations, how the train system will move to maximize the deployment of troops. And so you end up with what is called the mobilization phase. Mobilization is when you call up your military to active duty. So you're the equivalent of their National Guard, their Army Reserves, the men who are working in business. They get the call, they go home, put on their uniform, assemble at the armory, get their weaponry, march to or drive to the railroad station, and they're deployed with their units. And so all of the nations of Europe have general staffs, and they all have war plans. The most important war plan before the war is developed by Count von Schlieffen, the head of the German General Staff. Von realizes that even though this part of the world, between northeast France and western Germany and the Low Countries, has an incredible density of railroads, it's still not enough to properly deploy the German army in peacetime. So, what the Schlieffen Plan is going to do is go on the defensive on the Franco-German border. There are the Vosges Mountains near the town of Mulhouse, and the Germans will be on the defensive. But everyone at this point is obsessed with attack, attack, attack. You win wars not by defense, but by attack. So if Schlieffen says the Germans are going to defend themselves on the Franco-German border, where are they going to attack? Aha! Through the Low Countries. The goal of Schlieffen's plan is the city of Paris, right here. Got to get those parasites. So, I know they like to be called Parisians, but if I call them parasites, it irritates them. So, Schlieffen's plan is for a giant wheeling movement through Belgium primarily and Holland that will take Paris from the north and the west. You go beyond Paris, and then you attack eastward. The Schlieffen Plan is Germany and Germany's great knockout punch against France. Now, not only will Germany be on the defense on the Franco-German frontier, Germany will be on the defense on the Prussian and Silesian frontiers. In fact, Schlieffen expects the Russians will take a really long time to get moving. But even if they don't, he's willing to temporarily lose East Prussia and parts of Silesia. The Russians aren't going to move quickly. He's pretty sure of that. And so the Germans will fight on the defensive and give ground in the east. They'll fight on the defensive on the Franco-German border to have the maximum power in their attack through the Low Countries, this wheeling maneuver. This is the Schlieffen Plan. Now, the French have their version. It's Plan 17. The French are going to attack across Alsace-Lorraine, and if they get beyond it, they're going to basically aim their armies right towards Berlin. The Russians have their plans, too. Everyone has war plans. Yes?
So did Schlieffen, initiate all of this?
Well, we're going to see. Schlieffen Plan actually does cause some things that the Germans really wouldn't want. We'll get there. We'll talk about that. Yes?
I feel like World War II is kind of just round two this plan.
Oh, it is. Except Hitler does a better job.
Yeah, it just works better.
Yeah. Well, he also doesn't go do a wheeling maneuver. He does a maneuver to isolate the Allied armies. We'll talk about that when we do World War II. I actually do take the time to cover it. So this is everyone is poised, and everyone is ready to mobilize, and everyone expects war is inevitable. And when everyone is thinking, it's inevitable, it becomes inevitable. It becomes a certainty. Now, there's an ideology called PanSlavism, which isn't dead. PanSlavism says that all of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe have common interests and that Russia is their big brother. Little tovarish. We will take care of you. The Serbians have played on this. Serbians are Eastern Orthodox Christians. They are Slavic in blood. And they have been working with the Russians against the Austrians for generations. Pan-Slavism makes the Russian leadership and people emotional about things. In the Balkans, they are not going to allow the Germanic-dominated Austro-Hungarian Empire to harm the Serbs, or the Romanians, or the Bulgars, or anyone else. They are going to offset Austria, which is going to increase the chances of war. Russia, in essence, guarantees Serbia. Now, this area here that I'm going to shade in green is called Bosnia-Herzegovina. And Bosnia-Herzegovina has a city that is its capital called Sarajevo. Sarajevo. So, the Austrians are ruled by Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph, or Franz Joseph, has been emperor since the 1848 uprisings. He's still around in 1914. In fact, he lives until 1960. Incredibly old guy, incredibly sad life, but devout Catholic, interesting guy. Anyway, his eldest son dies under suspicious circumstances. His next son is named Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand is the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. He is the heir to the throne. But Franz Ferdinand falls in love with a woman named Sophie. Sophie is a commoner. Franz Ferdinand tells his family, I'm marrying the woman I love. Well, your kids are not going to inherit. You're going to have what's called a morganatic marriage. A morganatic marriage means that you're married, but your kids will not inherit. Your younger brother, Max, will inherit, not your sons. And Franz Ferdinand says, fine, I'm going to marry the woman I love. So he marries Sophie. Franz Ferdinand also believes that the solution to Austria-Hungary's problems is to give people other than the Hungarians home rule. Remember, the 1848 problems are solved when Austria becomes Austria-Hungary, when the power is split between the Germans and the Hungarians. Franz Ferdinand wants to do this with the Slavs that live within the empire, with the Croats, with the Slovenes, with the Bosnians, with the Italians, with the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Poles. Franz Ferdinand imagines a future confederation that's a unified empire but multicultural, multilingual. Something like that's never really succeeded, but Franz Ferdinand has high hopes. He's just waiting for his father to die. He loves his father, but his father has these really old-fashioned ideas. So Franz Ferdinand, in the summer of 1914, June of, is going to go to Sarajevo in order to encourage the people in Bosnia to be pro-empire and to be patient. He's going to quietly suggest that he has a better future for them planned within the empire. So he and Sophie arrive. And when they arrive at the train station, they get into a series of open coach cars. And they start doing a parade through the city, and they're going to go to the palace, the local government house, at lunch. So they start touring the city. Waiting for them, organized by the Serbian government, a foreign government, is a terror group known as the Black Hand, which is sort of a general term for gangsters. But the Serbian Black Hand in Bosnia is controlled by the Serbian government. It is an agent of Serbian policy. And one of the chief terrorists within the Bosnian Black Hand is the most successful terrorist ever in all of human history. Makes bin Laden look like a piker. The most successful terrorist in human history is named Gavrilo Princip. Gavrilo Princip is a young Bosnian Serb who wants unity between Bosnia and Serbia. He wants the Germans and the Hungarians out. And he has agreed to kill Franz Ferdinand. So in the morning parade, there's a bomb plot. Gavrilo Princip's cell is waiting along the parade route, and they throw grenade-style bombs into the carriages. But the bombs are lifted up and thrown back from Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's car. There's a general that's killed in front. I think the mayor of Sarajevo is injured or killed. So people in the car in front of him are seriously injured and killed, but he and his wife are fine. And they continue the tour, and Princip and his people just scatter, and they manage to evade capture, and they're all scattered. They're all separate from one another. And everyone breaks for lunch. Franz Ferdinand goes to the palace and has lunch with his wife and with the local officials. And Franz Ferdinand's security people are saying, look, that bomb plot indicates just how dangerous. We've been telling you for months. This is dangerous, what you're doing. There are people here who want you dead. Please, stay here this afternoon. Don't continue your parade. We're going to have a big gala this evening. It's going to be nice. We'll have people in a controlled environment. We'll have people see you, but with security. And Franz Ferdinand, in essence, says, if we cancel our afternoon parade, the terrorists win. I'm not going to let the terrorists win. So after lunch, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie and the entourage get back in cars, and they start putting at walking pace through the rest of Sarajevo. And now we come to those amazing accidents of history that change everything. The leading driver of the caravan makes a wrong turn. And instead of staying on the big wide boulevards, he goes into a maze-like set of old streets in the old section of Sarajevo. And as they're putting along at walking pace in these open vehicles, Gavrilo Princip is ahead of them. He doesn't know they're coming yet until he hears them. And he hears them. And they're coming. They're coming right to him. Now, he doesn't have any bombs anymore. But he's got his pistol. Bam, 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 bam! And he runs. He perforates Franz Ferdinand and his wife and evades capture. They speed up, but these are early cars. They don't really go much faster than a running man. And they try to get back to the palace, and they eventually do. And they're both dead. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie dead, killed by Prinkipp. That evening, Prinkipp is arrested, is beaten the hell out of, and he talks and reveals that he's an agent of the Serbian Black Hand. And he gives evidence to that. Now, the Austrian government has just had the heir to the throne, the equivalent of their vice president, assassinated under the orders of a foreign government. That's an act of war. There's no question about it. And the Serbians have been caught, perish the pun, or forgive the pun, red-handed. So, at this point, we enter the chief of the Austrian General Staff, Conrad von Hötzendorf. And Conrad von Hötzendorf wants to conquer Serbia. His goal, his long-term solution to the question of how to expand into the Balkans is for Austria-Hungary to absorb Serbia and Montenegro as well in preparation for absorbing eventually Albania, Romania, and so forth. So he doesn't want peace. He wants war. And the Serbians, by killing the heir to the throne, have provided a perfect pretext for war that will get the Austro-Hungarian people behind the fight. So a series of about a dozen demands are made, are written up by Hötzendorf and approved by the old Emperor Franz Joseph. But before they send them out, a message is sent to the Kaiser, who's vacationing on his yacht. His yacht is heading across the North Sea up to the fjords of Norway. And just before the Kaiser leaves, he gets this first message from the Austrians, and he's furious. He knew Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was sort of a friend of his. They went hunting together. And the Austrian ambassador asks, will you back our play? We have these demands. And Kaiser Wilhelm, being Kaiser Wilhelm, says, those bastards killed your crown prince, your grand archduke. Yes, of course, we'll stand behind any reasonable demands that you have. So Hötzendorf takes this and runs with it. Just like Bismarck with the old M's telegram, Hötzendorf is going to use this as an opportunity. Now, the Serbs have consulted with the Russians, and the Russians have said, you screwed up, pal. You're going to have to take some hits on this one. We're not going to be able to protect you. The only thing we'll do is if the Austrians invade, then we'll defend you. We'll guarantee that, but you're going to have to give. So the Serbs give on every point but one. The last demand that Hötzendorf has the Austrians make to Serbia is that the Serbs will allow Austrian troops and police forces onto Serbian soil to hunt down and arrest everyone involved in this plot, which includes senior Serbian officials. The Serbs say to Austria's demands, yes, 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 no. Because no country in the world can allow its sovereign territory to be violated by an army, by army units, and retain their sovereignty. When the Serbs, if the Serbs had allowed the Austrians into Serbia, that would have been the end of Serbia, and everyone knew it. It was an unreasonable demand. It was a demand the Kaiser shouldn't have backed, but the Kaiser was angry and he didn't really look closely at the fine print. This is Hötzendorf's work. When the Serbs refuse the last demand, Austria-Hungary mobilizes its forces. When the Russians hear of it, Russia mobilizes its forces against Austria. When the French hear the Russians have mobilized, they mobilize. Then Germany mobilizes. But at this point, a great error in everyone's thought process is revealed. Imagine I'm holding a revolver. That's a pistol with a cylinder. Revolvers usually have spurred hammers. So if I want to threaten somebody with a revolver, what I will often do is pull back the hammer, and it'll hang in place. If I don't pull back the hammer, it's a big, hard trigger pull to activate the pistol. But if I have the hammer cocked, all I have to do is touch the trigger, and the pistol will go off. Everyone assumes that mobilizing your army is cocking the pistol, is pulling back the hammer. It's not shooting the weapon. It's getting ready. It's threatening somebody with the weapon. Everyone thinks that when you mobilize troops, you've pulled the hammer back, it's locked into position, don't touch the trigger unless you mean to use it. Everyone thinks that. And they're wrong. For example, the Schlieffen Plan, recognizing that there aren't enough railheads within Western Germany, on day 2 of mobilization, has German troops in Luxembourg and eastern Belgium. Now, the Schlieffen Plan is altered so Holland isn't going to be a part of it, but basically, once Germany starts to mobilize, Belgian neutrality is immediately violated. The Germans don't really understand this. Nobody does. Britain has a treaty with Belgium. This is going to be important. So everyone mobilizes. And then the Belgians start squawking that they're invaded. The Germans point out the French are attacking near Mulhouse. The Russians are moving into Polish Galicia, which is Austrian territory. Everyone, as they're mobilizing, failed to understand that with the war plans they have, it is not 2 discrete movements. It is not draw, pull back the hammer, and threaten. It's one movement. Draw. What that means is, the moment political authorities began mobilizing their forces, war was going to happen. The politicians didn't really understand this. The politicians thought that they could threaten with mobilization. No. The war plans of the various parties equated mobilization with war. This misunderstanding sets the world on fire. So, the Germans are in Belgium and Luxembourg. The British have a treaty obligation to aid France and Russia. But British politicians are really on the fence about whether to do this or not. They might instead just take a bunch of German colonies and leave the French to fight alone on the continent. The French don't want to do this because they'll lose. But when the Germans march into Belgium, the scrupulous diplomatic British government gives the Germans, I think it's 48 hours to evacuate Belgium. The Germans keep pouring hundreds of thousands of troops into Belgium. So Britain not only declares war, but it moves its small standing army immediately to France. All of this because people did not understand. Sir Edward Grey, British Foreign Minister, famously says, as war is declared, the lights are going out all over Europe. They will not come back on in our lifetimes. And he was right. Really, Europe had not recovered from the world wars until at least the dawn of the second millennium, until around the year 2000. One of the things that's at risk in the current struggle is whether Europe's entire post-World War II standard of peace and prosperity is going to be destroyed. It could very well be. So, this is the cause of the war. And you need to be clear on that. Are there any questions? And by the way, the reason that Gavrilo Princip is the most effective terrorist in all time is his actions lead to World War I, and World War I changes absolutely everything. There is not a single thing on planet Earth that remains the same after the war as it was before. Governments rise, governments fall, new ideas are tried, borders change, entire regions change. Everything changes. The First World War is the great fulcrum event of modern history. Nothing, not the French Revolution, not World War II is more important than it. World War II is the turning point. World War I is the turning point. Yes?
So what do you mean when you say peace could be destroyed again with everything that's happening?
Well,
like in what way?
What I mean is that the peace that existed in 1914 had lived for 100 years. The Crimean War was a minor flash in the pan. There hadn't been what's called a general war, a full-scale war between major nations, since Napoleon's defeat 100 years before. So there's been 100 years of peace, prosperity, industrial development, civilian life, and the idea of the horrors of war had become unthinkable to most civilized people. Same thing has happened in Europe since World War II. It's taken generations, but most Europeans, as I understand it, assume that peace is normal. This is especially true in Western Europe. Peace is not normal, and the prosperity that the lifestyles that we've all grown accustomed to depend upon is put at risk when you start having wars that could spread and become major wars. Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons and others. The Chinese have threatened the use of nuclear weapons against anyone who stands against them in Taiwan. This is amateurish stuff. You don't threaten the use of nuclear weapons because the beginning of use could end life on Earth. And there is a parliamentarian in the Duma, the Russian parliament, that is talking about reclaiming Alaska and California because of Russian colonies there that were purchased from the Russian Empire in the 1800s. No, we're not going to. No. I get your point, but no. So, does that answer your question? The whole idea of peace as normal is what's called into question. When you've had peace for as long as we have, war quickly opens your eyes to the realities of life. And the realities are still pretty brutal. We don't want to deal with that. And if we're lucky, we won't have to. But if a general war comes, as it came in 1914, everything could change. There are some other things I failed to mention that I'm going to cover fairly quickly. In the Sudan, south of Egypt, there's an Islamic messiah in the 1880s and 90s called the Mahdi. Mahdi is their word for basically the second coming of Christ, but it's the arrival of the Islamic Messiah. So a Mahdi claims to be the Islamic Messiah, and for about 15, 20 years he controls the Sudan. A couple of British armies are sent south in their cream. In 1898, the British send an army under a guy named Kitchener to fight the Fuzzy Wuzzy Muzzies. This is what they were called. They were called Fuzzy Wuzzies because they have kinky hair and they were Muslim. It was before political correctness. And in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, Winston Churchill was a young cavalry officer. The last cavalry charge of the British army anywhere in the British Empire succeeds at breaking the Mahdi's forces and bringing the Sudan into British control. Now, the British march south from Khartoum, the capital, and they meet a French force marching east towards the Nile at a place called Fashoda. It looks like there's going to be an Anglo-French war because the French want territory along the Nile and the British want to control the entire river. The British win. It's not a fight. It's a standoff, and the French back down. Why? Because the French already control most of West Africa, and the British have a bigger army on the ground. So at Fashoda, the Nile River is clearly going to be English or British from source to sea. The Ottoman Turks throughout this period are called the sick man of Europe because all of this territory was once under Ottoman control. And slowly but surely, the Ottomans have been losing their territory in Europe. They are propped up by the British for most of the 19th century. The sick man of Europe can barely hold on. The Greeks get independence. The Albanians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Serbs, the Montenegrins all get independence from the Ottoman Empire. The only bit of Europe that remains under Ottoman control is this area near Constantinople and the Dardanelles Peninsula, near the waterway between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. Finally, autarky is economic self-sufficiency. The Chinese have, before industrial times, a version of autarky. They don't need to trade for anything they want. They have basically everything they need within their empire. In the modern world, autarky is almost impossible because all industry needs resources from around the world. So the idea of hunkering down and just relying on the American economy to supply all our needs doesn't work. We need global trade. Most societies do. But oftentimes dictators try to pursue autarky to increase their power and decrease the influence of foreigners. Finally, there are two economists in modern times that dominate. I'm going to send you video links there to a couple of rap battle videos between John Maynard Keynes, who's the father of modern left-wing economics. Most liberal Democrats are Keynesians. And F.A. Hayek, who believes that state-oriented economics is going to lead back to serfdom. And Hayek is the great economist of conservatives. They are funny. I wish I had time to play them in class. I may have time to begin playing one, but it's not. You should see both. The second actually is a little better, but you need the first to get the second. So if you hear Hayek, think conservative economist. If you hear Keynes, think liberal. And your exam is tomorrow. So thank you very much. I'm going to play the video now.